Greetings. Well, yesterday I was into talking about amendments that we'd purchase. I kind of neglected really to get into manures, which certainly manures are available commercially. They're also available on the farm if you happen to have animals. And, well, in my opinion, most manures are more of a fertilizer than they are an amendment. They generally break down far too quickly in the environment to actually be considered much of an amendment. Some of them, though, are actually very good fertilizers. I had gotten away from using them for years. When we had a farm, we had chickens and pigs. I used to, use manure as a fertilizer. While living in California, I pretty much switched over to using plant materials as fertilizers. I do the same thing here, but Hawaii's high rainfall really flushes nutrients from soil very quickly, and so I have gone back to using manures again too to supplement this, because the plant materials I'm using are simply just not potent enough to be able to grow, say, a crop like corn. It just won't develop. So we need more. We need more. So when it comes to manures, then, like I say, I consider them more fertilizers than amendments, but some of them really aren't very good fertilizers either, especially not when they're purchased. When you're buying manure or harvesting it from your own production, poultry is the top of the list as far as the value is concerned as a fertilizer. It burns up too quickly in the soil to really be considered much of an amendment. It doesn't change soil structure very much. Mostly it feeds plants. But when looking at manures can kind of divide as hot or cold. And that's associated pretty much with moisture content. That rather dry, rather solid manures tend to be much higher in nutrient value, and the wet manures, sloppy stuff, tends to be pretty low. So that makes poultry, for instance, pretty much top of the list. It's 55% water. It's 68% water. We have sheep, that's just below. Horse, it's 78% water. A little bit better than swine, which is 87% water. And then cow, which is 86% water. And cow, which is, commonly sold in bags. You see steer manure in sacks, and it's cheap too. They sell it for a pretty low price. It's not worth much of anything, and in fact it could be considered a real negative because of the high salt content. Steer manure is predominantly harvested in the United States from feeder lot operations. So this is where you pack all these cows that have been range fed into a concrete slab behind fences and start pumping water and food at them to get them ready for market, fatten them up. See, it takes some scrawny old Texas cow or range animal and pump it with enough corn and soybeans and water that it fattens up and becomes reasonable beef. To get this to happen, they feed the cows tremendous amounts of salt licks, because weight gain is also associated with water and water retention. And so these animals get salt, along with food, along with water. Well, the salt passes off into the manure through the urine, and it accumulates. So you end up with a whole lot of sodium chloride, which is not good. There generally is not a lot of any kind of solid organic matter in cow manure. even when it's been dried down. Plus, the phosphorus content of the stuff pretty much goes out with the urine. So once the liquid is removed or drained off, you've lost the phosphorus content. You still have a little bit of nitrogen left if they've composted it. Most of the nitrogen will go up during the composting process, but there'll be a little bit left in the bag. In the case of chicken manure, that can be purchased as composted, which would be lower value, but it can also be purchased as dry manure. And dry manure with chicken is plain rocket fuel. Yeah, that's a fertilizer. But my suggestion to people who are confused by all of this is that manure is not required for a good garden or a good crop. There are many other ways you can grow the crop. B, much of the manure that's on sale is worthless as far as the value, some things like mushroom compost. Now, here's another one that sells too. You see that in the stores? There ain't much nothing left of that stuff by the time you buy it, because it's pretty much made out of wheat straw and horse manure is what they use in there. That's what the meadow mushrooms like to grow on. And so, for starters, the manure has already been composted with the straw, so it's partially broken down. Then they send the mushrooms after it, and the mushrooms use up a lot of the nutrients in the growth process. We used to use it in Illinois as mulch on vegetable gardens because I had mushroom farming operations right near me. And in those days, they would give the stuff away in a big pile. So you go in and load it in your truck. Nowadays, you got to buy it in a bag. What I recall about it is that it goes up like that. It's just gone. There's almost no nutrient in it. That's pretty well burned out. And the organic content of it is so soft that it just burns up. It has no lifespan whatsoever. Cow manure is similar to very little lifespan in the stuff. It doesn't hold up. So you're not getting much nutrient out of mushroom compost, and you're not getting much amendment out of it either. We used to use it as a mulch to keep weeds down. It worked best on top of the ground. Just pile it up around the tomatoes, pile it up around the string beans,
in the category of fertilizers
so that the weeds wouldn't overrun stuff.
These are
It's
different.
good for that. It's like fish emulsion, for instance,
on the top
or
of the ground,
just
it'll
fish,
hold
period,
through the
fish
crop.
waste.
You get enough mulch
These
to
are
make it through the green.
barely soil amendments. They haven't got much value that way, but they are good fertilizers. Fish is a very good fertilizer. Fish bone meal, for instance, is the highest quality source of phosphorus that most of us know. It's one of the more expensive phosphorus fertilizers you can buy. When it comes to so much of this type of organic stuff, or like soft rock phosphate, for instance, as a fertilizer, or bone meal, the phosphorus doesn't release easily out of these things. All right, the phosphorus can be found from an application of bone meal as much as 9 years after the fact in the soil. It's not very mobile. And it also doesn't get to the plant until it becomes in a form that a plant can assimilate. So it's a lot of things like iron, for instance. You can throw rusty nails and stuff out there in your garden, and I suppose they eventually supply some iron. But the iron is generally not in a form that your plants can utilize. That's why we sell chelated iron, for instance. In the chelated form, the iron it can be assimilated. Most of the stuff like rock phosphate or iron supplements and whatnot, these things all have to go through the soil biota. They got to go through the gut of an earthworm. They got to be worked on by bacteria and fungi and so on before they actually do come into the state where they're useful to plants. Some things like seaweed, because seaweed is a plant. And so the materials that are in seaweed are usually in the form that other plants can utilize. So seaweed's a very good thing. It's, make sure it's been leached to get the salt out of it. It doesn't hold up well enough on land to really consider it much of an amendment, although it does make a pretty good mulch, just like mushroom compost. But it's got some very high mineral contents, especially in the trace mineral stuff. Seaweed's loaded. Everything that's in seawater. So it's a good fertilizer, and it's in a state that a plant can utilize. This is an issue. Like, you can throw all kinds of stuff out there at the ground, but plant can't use it. Most of this stuff is more stimulation to soil microbes than it is to actual stimulation to the plant. It's like, for instance, there's a thing about using sugar to sweeten flavors in plants as a fertilizer. Well, that's pretty much complete BS. Plants cannot absorb sugars. They make sugars. They don't absorb them. And so what happens when sugar or molasses is applied, it basically becomes a fertilizer. It's a stimulation for the soil microbes. And then in turn, the soil microbes will release some nutrients that will then be used by the plants. So much of this stuff goes through that cycle. It's useless for the plant as it is. It has to cycle. Once it's cycled, then it can become useful. But sometimes that actually takes years, depending. Sometimes months, sometimes weeks, but sometimes years, depending on what it is you put on the soil. Okay, there we go. That's the second part here. More about nutrients than about amendments. I just wanted to make that distinction. And also wanted to put in my 2 cents about how I feel on manure. Most of it isn't worth the money you pay for it. It's not something that's highly desirable or very cost effective. It's way overpriced in most cases and pretty useless. All right, folks, hang loose. Aloha. Catch you around.